Pretty much everybody plays fantasy football, and every once in a while, there's a player who just comes out of nowhere, becomes a household name, and then completely disappears. In today's video, I thought I would talk about a couple of those guys. We're going to talk about 8 different players who you really only know because of fantasy football, who are either one-game wonders or just kind of fell off after 1 year or a couple of games. There's 8 great examples of that, and that's what we're going to do today. But before we get started, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you're going to support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's get started and talk about 8 players you only know because of fantasy football. Honestly, all 8 of these guys deserve their own videos, but the first guy I want to talk about is Barnidge. He ended up growing up in the city of Bowling Green, Kentucky, and played high school at Middleburg High School. He ended up going to Louisville from 2004 to 2007 and actually had a decent career there. As a senior, he had 53 catches for 655 yards and 7 touchdowns, and then would end up going off to the draft. He was drafted in the 2008 NFL Draft in the 5th round with the 141st overall pick and was taken by the Carolina Panthers. Honestly, he really didn't do much for Carolina, as his first 4 years he only started a total of 6 games and really didn't do much. In 2013, he'd end up going over to Cleveland, and for those first 2 years in Cleveland, he didn't do anything. Then randomly in 2015, Barnidge blew up. He had 79 catches for 1,043 yards and 9 total touchdowns. He said, quote, "Basically anytime I do an interview or anyone finds out who I am, I've yet to see a percentage of the winnings." That was after he was told that he's won a ton of people their fantasy football championships. He had one of the most shocking out of nowhere NFL seasons ever, as heading into 2015, he had been in the NFL for 7 years and was 30 years old and only had 44 catches to his name. Then, in just that one season, as I said, he had 79 catches for 1,000 yards and 9 touchdowns, and he was the second highest scoring tight end behind Rob Gronkowski that season. No one knew his name at the beginning of the year, and he would end it with a Pro Bowl. As quickly though as he appeared, he signed a contract extension and then faded away. Barnidge would catch 55 passes for 612 yards and 2 touchdowns in 2016, and then I guess just completely disappeared off the face of the earth. Everybody knows Barnidge though, and I remember that one catch he had with his feet. Another really fun name from fantasy football is Travis Fulgham. Hopefully that name brings back some nostalgia for you, as coming out of Ashburn, Virginia, he ended up attending both a military academy and a normal high school, and he played 2 years of high school football. He ended up spending 5 years with Old Dominion, and after he redshirted and joined the team as a walk-on, he would earn a scholarship. As a senior, he led Conference USA with over 1,000 receiving yards and was named a second-team All-Conference USA player. He ended up going off to the NFL and was taken in the 6th round with the 184th overall pick by the Detroit Lions. He ended up going on and off the Lions his first year and then was eventually waived in 2020. He was picked up by the Green Bay Packers and then waived before the season even started. Then from there, he was picked up by the Philadelphia Eagles and was promoted to the active roster on October 3rd of 2020. This is where the Travis Fulgham story really starts. The next day in a Sunday Night Football game against the 49ers, he caught his first NFL pass and a 42-yard pass for his first career touchdown. Then he blew up. The following week, Fulgham caught 10 passes for 152 yards and a touchdown in a loss to the Steelers and became the 11th player in Eagles history with that kind of stat line. The next week against the Ravens, he had 6 catches for 75 yards and a touchdown, and Fulgham was becoming a guy that everyone picked up off waivers. He was the Eagles' #1 receiver on the team, and then he just disappeared. He had 9 catches over his next 7 games, and then never played again after the 2020 season. Fulgham would then sign with the Dolphins in 2021 and was released. He then signed with the Broncos and was released, signed with the Packers and was released, and then ended up going up to the CFL. Fulgham was literally one of the most random players ever, and you really only know him because of that little fantasy football stretch. Do you guys remember Charrick West? I definitely do. Coming out of Shreveport, Louisiana, he ended up going to Spring Hill High School and was named an All-State player after putting up huge numbers. He decided to commit to Louisiana Tech and actually played corner there. He then would transfer to Abilene Christian and played 4 total years there, running for over 2,000 yards and 22 touchdowns. Going into the 2014 NFL Draft, West was not able to get selected, but would end up playing for the Kansas City Chiefs. He was cut during the final rounds of roster cuts in 2014, but appeared in 6 games as a rookie, primarily on special teams. Then in 2015, Charrick West went off. Charrick West was the next great option for the Chiefs. Jamal Charles went down with some sort of injury, so Charrick West was promoted to running back 1, and everyone picked him up in fantasy. He had a couple of good games in 2015, which included 110 yards and a touchdown against the Steelers, and then he had 2 more touchdowns in the following weeks against Detroit and Denver. But other than that, Charrick West was actually kind of disappointing, and one of those guys that everyone hyped up in fantasy, but was a complete bust. That's the thing though, people only know him because of fantasy football. He was never that good and was never really that hyped up, but people were just trying to find the next big thing, and Charrick West was a victim of that. Another guy you only remember because of fantasy football is Ajayi. He was actually born in London, England to Nigerian parents and moved to the States when he was 7 years old. He eventually went to Liberty High School in Frisco, and as a senior ran for 2,200 yards and 35 touchdowns. He was apparently a 3-star recruit and decided to sign with Boise State. The Broncos were a pretty good place to play, and from 2011 to 2014, Ajayi had a tremendous career. He had 500 yards and 4 touchdowns as a freshman, 1,400 yards and 18 touchdowns as a sophomore, and then as a junior, he blew up. He had 1,800 yards and 28 touchdowns for the Broncos, and in total ran for nearly 4,000 yards and 50 scores in his time as a Bronco. He ended up getting drafted in the 5th round of the 2015 NFL Draft and was taken at pick number 149 by the Miami Dolphins. In 2015, he was placed on IR, but then, out of nowhere, he actually became really good. In 2016, he would start 12 games, running for 1,272 yards and 4 total touchdowns. Honestly, he didn't really put up the touchdown numbers that fantasy owners liked, but he did put up yards and was always a popular pick. After that, though, Ajayi would just completely disappear. He'd only play in 13 games over the next 4 years, and ended up becoming a professional esports player. Everybody remembers Ajayi's 1 season with the Dolphins, and everyone had him on their fantasy team and were somewhat frustrated with him because he couldn't score touchdowns, but that's how you remember him. The 5th guy I want to talk about is Myles Gaskin. Coming out of Washington, he ended up playing in a suburb and ran for 2,100 yards and 35 touchdowns as a senior. He committed to play college football at Washington and actually ended up starting his true freshman year. He became the first true freshman in school history to rush for over 1,000 yards and ended up having a terrific time with the Huskies. He became a first-team All-Pac-12 selection in 2016, helped Washington get to the college football playoff, and continued on to be better and better. In 2018, he became the first Pac-12 player to have 4 straight 1,000-yard seasons and helped Washington get to the Rose Bowl. He ended up finishing his career with 5,323 rushing yards and held multiple school records. Despite that, he was not drafted until the 7th round, as he was taken with pick number 234 by the Dolphins. Just like Ajayi, Gaskin kind of came out of nowhere. In 2019, he ended up having 133 yards, and then in 2020, he had 584. Randomly in 2021, though, Myles Gaskin became a huge fantasy name. People were picking him up as a great backup player, and apparently he was really strange, as one week he'd go off and the next week he would suck, as he became one of the more irritating players in fantasy football. I saw on a Reddit thread that Gaskin actually won somebody a fantasy football championship, but despite having 612 yards and 7 total touchdowns that year, Gaskin just completely fell off in 2022 and has done nothing since. He played 4 games at Miami in 2022, 2 at Minnesota, and then 1 with the Rams. Now he's done, and Gaskin was another one of those guys that was a one-year wonder and decided to take a lot of weeks off. But you really only know him because of fantasy. The next guy I want to talk about is CJ Anderson. Coming out of California, he was an absolute star. He had over 4,000 yards during his high school football career and was the athlete of the year according to a ton of different newspaper publications. Instead of going to a big-time school like USC or Bama, though, he ended up at Laney College. He ended up becoming a first-team All-American while he was there, and then went on to play for Cal. As a junior, he ran for 345 yards and 8 touchdowns. Then as a senior, he ran for 790 yards and 4 scores. He'd end up declaring for the 2013 NFL Draft, and then would bounce around for a while. Anderson would first sign with the Denver Broncos as an undrafted free agent, but would not make the roster. They already had Noshawn Moreno, Monty Ball, and Ronnie Hillman, but he would eventually make his debut on October 27th of 2013 against the Washington Redskins. From there, he'd start a stretch where he was a pretty solid fantasy option. In 2014, he had 849 yards and 8 touchdowns. In 2015, he had 720 yards and 5 touchdowns. And then in 2016, he had 437 yards and 4 touchdowns. His best year would come in 2017, as he finally eclipsed 1,000 yards, and then he had 3 scores. But tons of people were angry because he was always one of those guys that was drafted in the first round, but didn't exactly live up to the fantasy hype. Was he a good NFL running back who had a lot of potential? Yes, but was he worth being a franchise fantasy back? No. He was not able to ever really put it together in that department, and everybody knows TJ Anderson because of that. He then ended up playing for Carolina, Los Angeles, and Detroit before he washed out of the NFL. TJ Anderson is one of those guys who is seen as sort of a one-hit wonder kind of player, as he had that great little stretch for a couple of years, but then just disappeared. The second to last guy we are going to talk about is Zach Stacy. He ended up becoming an under-the-radar type of player as he came out of Centerville, Alabama. Despite getting a ton of interest, he was down to Vanderbilt and UAB and chose to go to Vandy. He ended up having an insane career while he was in high school, as he finished with nearly 5,800 yards and 76 total touchdowns. He started as a true freshman for the Commodores in 2009 and ended up having a really solid career for the Doors. He finished with 478 yards as a freshman, 331 as a sophomore, 1,200 as a junior, and then 1,200 again as a senior. In total, he ran for over 3,000 yards and 30 touchdowns in his time at Vanderbilt and became a second-team All-SEC selection in 2012. He ended up going in the 5th round of the 2013 NFL Draft, and in his first year, he actually got somewhat popular. In the back half of 2013, Bleacher Report said, quote, "Zach Stacy is a must-start fantasy option moving forward. He had exploded over the last 2 weeks, and without Sam Bradford, he apparently became the main guy to hopefully get some fantasy points. Unfortunately, though, Zach Stacy would never really be able to put it all together. Stacy ended up having a great finish to the 2013 season, as he finished with 973 yards and 7 total touchdowns. Unfortunately, going into 2014, Stacy pretty much completely fell apart. He just had 293 yards and 1 score that entire year, and then he decided to be traded to the New York Jets, where he had 31 total yards in his time there. Unfortunately, not only was he a fantasy football bust, but he also got in trouble for committing an awful act in 2021. He apparently hurt his ex-girlfriend and his 5-month son, and that is absolutely awful. He ended up flaming out after becoming a big fantasy name in 2013, and then his career took an even darker path after that. Last but not least, we have to talk about Robert Tonyan. Everybody remembers him from the 2020 NFL season, but going back in time, this seemed like an impossible feat. He was a star quarterback from McHenry High School in Illinois and decided to enroll at Indiana State in 2012. He ended up playing quarterback there and was a first-team All-Missouri Valley Conference player eventually. He ended up playing 5 years at Indiana State before he would go undrafted in 2017. He would sign with the Lions, but was released before the season began. He was then signed to the practice squad for the Packers for the final 4 games of the 2017 season and did not catch his first pass until 2018. He then had 10 catches in 2019 before he randomly blew up in 2020. Against the Falcons in Week 4, Tonyan caught 6 passes for 98 yards and 3 touchdowns, and this was the 3rd straight week he had caught a touchdown. From there, though, he would kind of be disappointing until he would pick it up towards the back half of the season, scoring touchdowns in 6 of his last 7 games. Tonyan ended up having a weird year in which he caught over 60 passes for over 600 yards and 12 total touchdowns. Everybody picked up Tonyan because of fantasy and hoped that he'd have a big 2021 season, but he only ended up playing in 8 games and had 204 yards. Luckily, his feet got back under him in 2022 as he did catch 53 passes for 470 yards, but had a disappointing 2 touchdowns. In 2023, he did nothing for Chicago, and I think he's currently with the Minnesota Vikings. I'm not sure if he'll make a roster, but everyone remembers that one year that Robert Tonyan went from a no-name to a must-get fantasy player at the tight end spot. But now it is all done. So yeah, today we talked about 8 players for one reason or another you only know because of fantasy football. We went through who they were, their little rise and fall, and why they ended up being known. But what do you guys think? Should I do a part 2 to this video? And if so, who should I include in part 2? Who is the most random guy from this list? And what other topic should I cover next? Before you go, don't forget to also leave a like if you want to support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out all my other videos on the end screen. I hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.